Hey guys, I'm Amy May. I'm a doctor who's been on Mounjaro since April 2024 and I've lost 80 pounds. I've documented my entire journey here on YouTube, so if that is something that interests you, then I've got tons of playlists, tons of YouTube shorts, gym vlogs, everything, right? Week by week progress. So be sure to check that out and please subscribe because it would really help me out. Today it's going to be part one of a two-part series discussing Eli Lilly's Zyprexa Scandal, or olanzapine as the drug is known here in the UK. I was just going to do it all in a one-er, but to be honest there's a lot to get through, there's a lot to discuss, and the scandal is made up of two main parts. So we're going to discuss the first one today and then the second part in the next video. Eli Lilly, widely known for the manufacture and sale of Mounjaro or tirzepatide, is currently the largest pharmaceutical company in the world with a market cap of approximately $878 billion. It was founded in 1876 by chemist Eli Lilly, and although it's hard to imagine given the company's global success today, the company began with just 3 employees, including Eli's son, Hosea. Although today most people associate Eli Lilly with tirzepatide, especially tirzepatide being marketed as a weight loss aid and the rising popularity of GLP-1 medications, their success dates back to the 1800s, and Eli Lilly was one of the first companies known to mass produce both insulin and the polio vaccine. One of the first drugs that Eli Lilly manufactured was quinine, an anti-malarial drug used to treat the most common form of malaria found in humans, which is caused when the parasite Plasmodium falciparum is injected into the human's bloodstream. This happens when a certain genus of mosquito, specifically the female mosquito, it needs blood for their eggs to grow, so it bites a human, and if the female mosquito is infected by the parasite, then it will inject the parasite into the human's bloodstream when it's having a feed. Now, it's important to note that although Eli Lilly is credited for the production of this medicine, this anti-malarial, they didn't actually invent quinine, they didn't discover quinine, and its use to treat malaria is documented going back as far as the 1600s, but realistically it's likely to have been discovered way before that. Quinine is actually a component of the bark of the cinchona tree, which is native to the Andes, and legend has it that it was actually founded by the native population when a man who was delirious, dehydrated, and struggling with a high fever was lost in the jungle. Confused, delirious, trying to find something to drink, he drank from a stagnant pool of water, but it tasted very bitter. And then he suddenly started panicking because he realised that the water had been infected by the surrounding cinchona trees. The cinchona tree is also known as the quina tree. Now, I'm not going to front, I don't think I'm saying that right. Like Quina doubled. Quina. But anyway, regardless, that's where quinine gets its name from. And instead of being poisoned by this water that he drank, the man's panic started to subside when he realised that his fever was actually diminishing. His fever was actually going and he actually felt a lot better. And so then when he got back to his village, he shared this story with the village people. And then since then, they started using quinine, a component of the bark, to treat high fever and then to treat malaria. Quinine is also a component of tonic water, which is very bitter tasting because quinine is bitter. And originally, tonic water was promoted and advertised to offer protection against malaria because it contained quinine, although realistically it probably wouldn't have done much. And again, we don't know what's true and what's not, but legend has it that British Navy soldiers, wanting protection against malaria but not fancying the bitter taste, mixed tonic water with gin to try and make it go down the hatch easier and make it more palatable, and that's where we get the famous gin and tonic cocktail from. Now, that could not be true. It could not be evidence-based. There may be no truth in that, but it is quite an interesting story all the same, that British Navy soldiers were like, oh, want protection against malaria, don't want it to taste dirty, bit of gin and tonic. So I suppose moving on, why is that relevant to what I'm talking about? Well, quinine was one of Eli Lilly's first major successes, and ever since then in the 1800s, they just grew and grew and their profits grew year upon year. But like every big pharma company, it's not without scandal. It's not without a bit of hearsay, a bit of rumour. However, unfortunately, some of it wasn't just rumour, some of it was true. In 1996, olanzapine, an antipsychotic drug used in the treatment of schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses, was approved in the United States under the brand name Zyprexa. Now, throughout this video, I'm probably going to chop and change between olanzapine and Zyprexa, but they're the same thing. It's the same drug. Zyprexa is just a brand name. But like in the UK, I've never prescribed Zyprexa in my life. It's olanzapine. So if I do sort of chop and change, don't worry about it. It's the same thing. So Eli Lilly patented Zyprexa or olanzapine in 1991. And in 1996, when it was approved by the FDA for use in the treatment of schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses, it quickly became Eli Lilly's best-selling product. It did them good, like it paid its dues. Between 1996, when it was first launched, and 2011, when it went off patent, it earned Eli Lilly about $30 billion in global revenue. The FDA stands for the Food and Drug Administration, and it's the federal agency in the US that's responsible for sort of managing and keeping an eye on the marketing and the efficacy of drugs. So in order for a drug to be approved for pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly to sell, right, to try and flog to people, first the FDA has to approve it for a specific indication. So the FDA has to look at the risks, the benefits, the clinical trials, all the evidence, and they basically decide, yeah, okay, I think the risk outweighs the benefit. I think it is actually evidence-based that it's good for this indication, and they give it the thumbs up. And that needs to happen before Eli Lilly can flog it. If the FDA is not approved a drug, then it's illegal for companies to market and sell that drug. And it's important to note that if the FDA has only approved a drug for a certain indication, for example, to treat psychosis, then you can't then go and market and sell the drug to treat anxiety, to treat, depression, to treat sleep disorders. It needs to be approved for a certain indication. So a drug can be approved for one indication and it can legally be marketed and sold for that indication, but you can't just take the mick. You can't just, go around pretending. But as we all know, this is big pharma. And as you can imagine, if a drug, especially one that you've patented, is doing the rounds, it's, the next big thing, it's the current speak of the ton, then you can imagine that companies would be incentivized to try and flog it for anything going. They wouldn't want anything to slow down or impede that cash flow if it's a moneymaker. America has the FDA, we have NICE, which stands for, I think, the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence, I want to say. I did a video a few months ago, I'll link it, just talking about the NICE recommendations in Mounjaro and the like. But basically, in the UK, it's NICE that's our regulatory body that has to approve a drug before the NHS can give it to people. So FDA in America, NICE in the UK. Zyprexa, or olanzapine as it's known to us Brits, is currently licensed by the FDA for use in schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and as an adjunct in treatment-resistant depression. So why is this such a big deal? Why am I making such a big deal of this? Well, there's two major parts to this Eli Lilly Zyprexa scandal, and neither of them have any redeeming qualities. You ain't coming here getting redemption. But we're going to talk about the first one today. And the first one is that Eli Lilly marketed and sold Zyprexa or olanzapine, an antipsychotic medication, for the treatment of dementia, including Alzheimer's dementia, and for symptoms associated with dementia, including agitation, sort of sleep-wake cycle disturbance, insomnia, anything they could get their little paws on, essentially. The FDA have never approved Zyprexa for the use of treatment of dementia or its associated symptoms. So it's bold. It was bold of Eli Lilly to say, yeah, okay, not only the treatment of dementia, like it's literally never been known to be a cognitive enhancer, but the management of its symptoms. And not only is it bold, it's illegal. So essentially, once all the scandal had unfolded and once they couldn't, they were up the creek without a paddle, in 2009, they finally took a plea deal, one of the biggest in sort of pharmaceutical history. I'm sure it was like 1.4 billion. And they basically pled guilty to, I think, a misdemeanor criminal charge. Not sure what that means. I think they took a plea deal, which meant basically they kind of had to. They kind of had to, but we'll come on to the whys and whereabouts. Some people might not think it's a big deal, but to really understand the gravity of the situation, we need to have context. So not only has Zyprexa ever been shown in clinical trials or approved for the use as a cognitive enhancer, which is something that, you know, basically tries to slow down memory loss in dementia, it's also never been approved for the use of agitation, anxiety, sleep disturbance. And on top of that, we know that it's especially risky for use in the elderly population, because not only are they already have, you know, a lot of elderly people have multiple comorbidities, polypharmacy, they're on loads of medication, but they're also, you know, a lot of elderly people are a falls risk. Not to be, it's true, right? So a lot of elderly people may already have reduced mobility and be on medications that might make them dizzy, off balance, off their feet. So not only does it increase the risk of falls in the elderly population, but it can also interact with other medications that are taken. For example, blood pressure medications, which a lot of elderly people are on, and that increases the risk of falls as well. And if we think a lot of elderly people are on blood thinners, right? If you fall and you hit your head, the consequences of that, if you're on a blood thinner, especially if you're frail, could be grave, it could be fatal. So not only is it never actually been approved, licensed or evidence-based for use in dementia, we know that it's especially risky in the elderly population because it can cause arrhythmias, it can cause, you know, increase your falls risk, interact with other medications they're on, cause all sorts of trouble. I know this is a bit too medical, but when you're prescribing olanzapine and other such medications, especially antipsychotics, you do an ECG, a heart tracing. I'm not trying to patronise you, but you know when they put the electrodes on and they do a tracing of your heart, right? And there's a thing that comes up called the QTC. Now, certain medications can prolong the QTC, and especially in the elderly, when they're already on a lot of other medications, that can lead to cardiac arrhythmias, and it can be fatal. Like, we always, when you're starting someone on olanzapine or Zyprexa, you need an ECG at baseline. You need a baseline ECG. You need to know what their QTC is, if they're on any other medications that will interact or also prolong the QTC, and you need to monitor. Eli Lilly didn't seem to, I don't think, the thing is, it's not they didn't grasp it, it's that they just didn't care. Because just you wait. There's some unsealed court documents that not only did Eli Lilly encourage their sales representatives to try and flog it for dementia and for symptoms of dementia, they essentially tried to flog it for anything going. And it is important to note that they specifically targeted primary care physicians or GPs with a big marketing campaign. Now, we call them GPs in the UK. I'm pretty sure in America it's primary care physicians. But they went in hard. They went in hard at primary care physicians, GPs, right? Especially those that had a large elderly population on the books or that were looking after a lot of nursing home residents. And the reason that, I mean, there's so many reasons that this is completely inappropriate and unethical, but the reason it's significant, one of, is that if you think about it, Zyprexa or olanzapine is an antipsychotic medication that is actually approved for the use of schizophrenia and other sort of psychotic illnesses. So the GP population, they're looking after the community, or, you know, which includes nursing home residents. But if somebody has a psychotic illness, for example, schizophrenia, they're much more likely to be referred to specialist services, like psychiatrists, right? And so the GP wouldn't necessarily look after them. And that's important because that means that Eli Lilly's sort of marketing people, when they're trying to flog it to GPs, given that only a minority of their population may have a sort of psychotic illness, they don't really have a leg to stand on when they're trying to flog it. So they just need to start making stuff up, because otherwise the GPs are going to be like, well, you know, it's not really relevant to me, I don't really need it, because, you know, a lot of my population, they've been referred to specialists if they do have a psychotic illness. When it all kicked off, basically documents were leaked. There was a big leak of documents, internal documents from Eli Lilly showing their clinical trial results, emails between people, like, you know, their marketing meetings, everything, right? That got out. And when that got out, it turns out that there was a 2001 document that basically stated that Eli Lilly was betting the farm on Zyprexa. and they wanted to achieve world-class commercialisation of Zyprexa because it was a massive moneymaker. And so in order to do that, they wanted to expand to the GP population. They didn't just want it to be used for its indication to treat psychotic illnesses. So they started a whole marketing campaign called Viva Zyprexa that specifically targeted GPs. And they just started making stuff up, essentially. And it turns out that in 1998, so 2 years after Zyprexa was launched and approved by the FDA for use in psychotic illnesses, Eli Lilly went to the FDA looking for approval to use Zyprexa for the treatment of dementia and associated symptoms. And the FDA were like, what are you on about? Like, there's not enough evidence. And so they withdrew their application, right? So they had a good go. They tried to go the official route, obviously didn't work, and so then they just started conniving. Whilst like rubbing their little hands together, part of the sales tactic aimed at primary care physicians or GPs was that Eli Lilly basically went in hard, and not only were they trying to flog it left, right and centre for agitation, insomnia, anxiety, depression, whilst trying to flog it to GPs, they overestimated the prevalence of bipolar 1 disorder in the population that the GP was treating. So GP, right, you've got your little community, or massive community, whatever it is, right, that you're treating. And obviously patients with a psychotic illness, they do tend to go to psychiatrists, specialists. But as part of their sales pitch, Eli Lilly's sales representatives basically completely overestimated the prevalence of bipolar 1 disorder in the GP's population. So they were saying to GPs, oh yeah, like X percentage of your population have bipolar 1 disorder, so it will really benefit them, when in reality a much smaller percentage actually had bipolar 1 disorder. So it was stuff like that they were just conniving with. They were just making stuff up because they bet the farm on it, and they wanted to achieve world-class commercialised, like they wanted to be like, you know, big dog for Zyprexa. So in order to try and flog it to the GP population, they were literally just making stuff up. Because if they hadn't done Cirque du Soleil with the truth, then no GP or primary care physician would be interested. They wouldn't have a sales pitch if they weren't making stuff up and just completely fabricating and truth bending. And if that wasn't bad enough, part of their sales pitch to PCPs or GPs, especially those looking after the nursing home and the elderly population, was the 5 at 5 campaign, which promoted giving 5 milligrams of olanzapine to the elderly population at 5 p.m. to treat agitation, nighttime wandering, insomnia, to knock them out, essentially. Especially 5 milligrams of olanzapine to like an olanzapine naive elderly person. That was part of their campaign, 5 at 5. A leaked email from one of the company's researchers, Peter Feldman, to Denise Torres, who was the company's global marketing director in 2002, stated that prescriptions for elderly patients was the second biggest moneymaker for Zyprexa in America at that time. And in that email, Feldman said that they were going to stop studying the potential health benefits, risks, for the elderly population of Zyprexa because that would risk killing the goose that lays the golden egg to save on poultry feed costs. Following an investigation which began in 2004 and led to the exposure completely of Eli Lilly in previously unsealed documents, in 2009 they eventually pled guilty. I think they took a plea deal to a misdemeanor charge and ended up paying $1.4 billion for promoting the off-brand use of Zyprexa. And they really doubled down. They held firm until they literally had to plead guilty. Like, it's kind of like, do you know All or Nothing by Cher? And she's like, baby, it's all or nothing now.